welcome back to Psych 121. I hope you guys had a good extended spring break. So for those of you that were in the Zoom meeting this morning, you already know this, but for those who couldn't attend, I'm going to explain a little bit about what's going on. So this recorded lecture is unique in that it's not via Zoom. It took me quite a while to devise a way to record this for you guys. So this morning we tried to have our first Zoom meeting. It turns out that my Zoom privileges were taken away. I, as you know, am a clinician in the counseling center, and clinicians are not allowed to screen share or record their Zoom videos. So without my knowledge, I had everything set up for us, and then yesterday they changed my Zoom privileges so I could no longer record, could no longer share the screen. So everyone that came this morning, you already know this, but I was not able to share my screen with you, and it was all very confusing because it did not look the same way for me that it looks for you guys, where it has different options along the bottom of Zoom. So I'm working to get that fixed. In the meantime, this first lecture, this is the first learning lecture, will just be recorded. There is no class present right now, so no students are here. I'll just be talking about the lecture and about the changes to the class, and then I'll upload it as well as upload the YouTube videos that I would have played for you guys on Zoom. So this lecture is going to be a little bit different than I wanted it to be, and a little bit different than how future lectures will go. So I'm hoping by Thursday, the 26th, we'll have everything sorted out, and I can see your faces again, and we can meet face to face, so to speak. For the time being, you'll just have to unfortunately watch this recorded lecture. Because there are no students present, it might be a little bit faster because I'm not able to ask you guys questions and I can't see you taking notes. So if this one seems a little bit fast, don't worry. I expect that the rest will go at a bit of a slower pace. So feel free to pause if you feel like I'm going through things too quickly. And just know that in the future, I am hoping that we can meet as a live class for those of you that are available during that time, and things can feel a little more cohesive and feel a little bit more like a class. So the first thing I want to do is go through this document that I sent you all, and this has the updates to our class. So this is basically me taking our syllabus and then going through the biggest, most important changes. So I want to talk a little bit more about each of those changes. So your instructor has not changed. Your intern Autumn has not changed. In the future, I'm going to make her co-host in our Zoom meetings, so she will also be able to help you guys out on there. So office hours have changed because we're moving to online classes. I am no longer going to be in the office, obviously, because we're not going to be on campus, but I'm pretty flexible, especially after hours. So if you guys do want to meet with me, we can meet via Zoom. We can set up a meeting. You can still email me with questions if you don't feel comfortable meeting on Zoom. But if you do want to meet face-to-face or talk in person or with audio, I can be pretty flexible. So just email me if you want to set up a meeting. If you can only meet at weird hours or on Saturday or Sunday, I can probably make that work too. So just let me know. I'm trying to check my email pretty often. I know that you're getting a lot of emails right now, so I'm trying not to spam you guys. But just bear with me as we're all kind of adjusting to this ever-changing situation. So we still have our Psy intern, Autumn. As you guys know, the Psy space on campus won't be physically active, but she will still be your intern, so you can still use her as a resource. And I think they'll still be operating, trying to create study materials, all of that good stuff. The biggest change that you guys are probably excited about is that I'm no longer going to take attendance. So I wasn't sure how I wanted to do this, but I've decided that with all of the things going on in your lives and the coronavirus, we're just not going to take attendance anymore. So some people have expressed that they literally can't come to class at our scheduled time. Others have just said they would prefer to watch lectures recorded on their own time when it's more convenient for them in their household. So you are all just going to get those points. They're not being taken away from you. You automatically will receive the attendance points for the entire second half of the semester. So I hope that that helps reassure you a little bit about your grade. You'll also get those points that you would have gotten last week during our extended spring break. you would have gotten 3 points. You'll all just get those as well. So I'm not taking attendance. That being said, I would encourage you to come to the live Zoom meetings. A bunch of you came today, and unfortunately it didn't work out as planned. But I was really happy that you guys came. And I think that having more structure and keeping it as much like a class as possible can be really helpful. So if you're someone like me that thrives with structure and is better at managing their time when they have more structure, then you might be someone that benefits from actually coming to the Zoom meetings. If you're someone that's very, like, you're a self-starter, you don't need someone to structure your time, you can organize that yourself, then maybe you don't need to come to those meetings, and maybe you can just watch the lectures recorded on your own time, and that's completely fine. You won't be penalized in any way for that. So I said I encourage everyone to attend the first Zoom meeting. Unfortunately, that didn't work out as planned, so this is the first Zoom meeting, but I appreciate you guys that did come. So I encourage you to come. You won't be penalized if you don't. Our class will meet live at the normal time via Zoom. I will email out the invite every day, the day before class, so that you guys can prepare and you can have that up and ready. I'm working with the university and the department chair to try to fix my Zoom so that we can have those screen sharing and recording options. So the way I want this to work in the future is that I will just record the live lecture, and that everyone who's just watching the recording will also get to hear the questions that you guys are asking or that you guys are typing in the chat. So my preferred way of doing this is that I won't record everything twice. We'll just record the live lecture. So be mindful if you're there, people will be able to hear what you're saying. And then those of you watching the recording will get all of the extra class activity type things that happen. So that's my goal. And then I will post those recordings onto YouTube. So as soon as this recording is finished, I will cut that down and figure out how to post it for you. This one will look a little bit different because I'm not using Zoom. I'm just recording this screen right now. But all the other ones will be recordings of Zoom, and then those will be posted. If you guys have issues playing the video or anything with like the audio, please let me know, because I don't want you guys to just say like, oh, that one didn't work. I will figure something out or re-record it if possible. So let me know if you have any issues. Homework is staying the same. However, the due dates have been pushed back. So at the end of this document, there's a course schedule that I've updated, so we can look at those new due dates when we get to the end. But just know that all of your reading homework assignments are still on Top Hat. They're still the exact same thing. You just fill out the questions as you're reading the chapter. They're just going to be different due dates. Okay, so scrolling through here. Our exam policy, we're still going to take the exams on Top Hat from your home, obviously. What's probably going to happen is it's going to be open note. However, I would not just go through your notes for every question. That's going to really slow you down. So what I would recommend doing is studying for the exam like you normally do, taking the exam, answering all the questions that you know how to answer, and then at the end, if you have extra time, that's when I would use the open note piece and say, okay, let me go back through my notes and try to figure out the answer to these questions I don't know. So I'm not trying to make things harder for you guys. So I think that will help people that have some questions they got stuck on. Maybe at the end, you can look up in your notes the answer or what you think the answer might be. However, know that it will still lock you out if you try to open another screen. So this is really only going to be open note if you have a separate device like your phone or if you have a physical notebook in front of you. So I'm fine with you using your notes, just know that you can't use it on the same device that you're taking the exam on. So that might mean if your notes are, you want to have your notes up on your laptop, you might want to take the exam on your phone and vice versa. Or you can have your physical notebook, whatever it may be. So we'll talk more about that when we're actually getting close to the exam, but know that that would be my advice, would be to take it as normal, to study as normal, to try to answer the questions without your notes. And then at the end, if you have time, that's when you go back through your notes. So we'll talk more about the exam once we get closer to exam 3. So your research requirement also has stayed the same. There are online surveys on Sona that you guys can do, and since everything is online now, I'm thinking that that's probably how you're going to get your research credits at this point. I believe the enhanced study, that's the one that we had those presenters come in and give a presentation on. I think that one is still going, so you can still do the enhanced study, and I think they're transitioning it to online. But if you don't want to do that one, there's plenty of online surveys. You can just go through on Sona and see what interests you and fill out whatever one you want. So this is really not any different than before. I just kind of wanted to remind you guys about that. So I have a little note about safety, getting groceries, or if you're having trouble finding a place to live right now because you've been displaced, please reach out to me, or you can do this through email to the Dean of Students. So that's in there for your needs if that describes your situation. Okay, another important piece that has changed is the grading system. And I'm getting a lot of emails about this. I don't have a lot of information for you guys yet because they're still working on implementing this new system. So basically, you can still take a grade the same way you would before. So everything above a 90 is an A, everything above an 80 is a B, everything above a 70 is a C, everything 60 and above, so these are inclusive, 90 and above, 80 and above, etc. Everything 60 and above is a D, and then everything below 60 is an F. So that's the normal grading scheme for our class. So what the university is doing because of the virus and the shift to online classes is they're saying, okay, now undergraduate students are going to have a period of time for each class where they can choose whether they want to take the letter grade, which is what I just described, or if they want to take a pass-fail grade. And a pass-fail grade means that if you score above a certain percentage, you pass. If you score below that, you fail. The problem with me not having answers to your questions about which one should you do yet is that I don't know what that cutoff is. So I think sometimes it's a C or above, it's just pass, but I don't know for sure what that is yet. So I don't want to tell you guys what you should do. So the university is going to finish formulating that new pass-fail policy. And again, it's optional, so you don't have to do that. And as soon as they finish formulating that, they'll send an email out to all of us. So not just me, but you'll also get that email. And that will help you determine whether you want to take the letter grade or the pass-fail. Letter grades usually affect your GPA, and I'm assuming that's how they're going to implement this policy. And usually pass-fail grades do not affect your GPA. So if you're someone that's like, I'm going to get an A in this class, I'm pretty sure I'm going to get an A in this class, I would go ahead and take the letter grade. That will boost your GPA. If you are really struggling, then you might want to go for the pass-fail grade. However, it depends on what that cutoff is and where your grade is at. So we'll just need to wait to see what the university says about that new policy in order to make a good decision for your individual situation. So like I said, I'll share more information about this change as it is released. We already talked about the PSYC space. Okay, so here's the updated course schedule. And I won't go through the whole thing, but I emailed you guys all this document. It's also on D2L, but I just want you to be aware that we are here in week 9 now. So we're on chapter 7, learning. The chapter 7 homework is due Tuesday, March 31st, and the homeworks will still be due before class. So even if you're not attending the Zoom class, your homework will still be due that day at 11 a.m. of the next class. So chapter 7 is due Tuesday. I think I have each of the homeworks in this unit due on Tuesday. And then exam 3 is going to be on April 14th. So I pushed that back a class period to give us more time because of all the time we lost because of the extended spring break. The one problem, well, we've had lots of problems, but one problem I foresee with this is that this kind of takes away our review day. So they basically removed 2 potential teaching days from our schedule. I've tried to take some of that content out of what you guys said you were least interested in. So that includes memory, and that also included treatments. Those were the things people were least interested in. So we're condensing those a little bit, and I'm hoping that means we will finish in time to maybe have some review on the last day before the exam. But if not, then unfortunately we won't have review in class. But again, it will be open note now, so I'm hoping that evens out the difficulty a little bit. So exam 3 is on April 14th. Then I have these next 3 homework due dates on here, and your final exam is for our scheduled final exam period. However, it will be again online, and that one's on May 7th. So you can read through this in more detail to see and fill out your calendar for what you need to do. However, I wanted to talk a little bit about grades. So I know that you guys are still waiting on your exam 2 grades and your midterm grades, and some of you homework and extra credit grades. So basically, I think I'm going to curve exam 2 a little bit more than I was originally planning. So I should have that up this week, and your midterm grades will be up by Friday. Originally, I wasn't going to curve it that much, even though it was hard. I removed a bunch of questions, and that boosted a lot of your grades. But with everything that's going on, I think we're probably going to curve it about 8 points. So that should significantly increase all of your exam 2 grades right off the bat. And then I'm also dropping a bunch of questions. So if you can see your exam 2 grade on top at, your actual exam 2 grade after the curve and after dropping those questions will be significantly better, and those will be posted this week. So I apologize for any delays or just anxiety about what your grade is in this class, but I'll have that to you this week, and then that will help you determine whether you should take the letter grade or the pass-fail option once the university gives us that info. So that's most of what I wanted to talk to you guys about with course changes. And again, this document has been emailed out and it's on D2L. Okay, guys, so now we're going to get into the actual lecture itself. So this is the first day of the learning lecture, and we'll continue with learning on Thursday. So learning is any change in behavior due to experience. Learning is relatively permanent. It's not due to drugs, maturation, or development. It's not due to injury or disease. So drugs can cause a temporary change in behavior. However, that is not learning. We also talked in the development chapter about maturation. So maturation can involve your body, for example, growing taller as you get older. That is something that you're biologically programmed to do. However, that is not you learning. No one had to teach you, oh, okay, go ahead and grow tall. That is something that is in your DNA, and that's just part of development and part of maturation. So that would not be learning. It's also not due to injury and disease for the same reasons. So those biological components, they are not an example of learning. Events can affect our behavior, and then our behavior can also affect our environment, and this can lead to learning. So behavior, and we talked about what behavior is a little bit when we talked about what is psychology. Behavior is any observable action that can be repeated, it can be measured, and it's affected by a situation to produce or remove some outcome. So some scientists might talk about the behavior of cells. So they might say that behavior can happen on the cellular level. In this class, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about things that we can actually observe, that we can actually measure, that can be repeated. So me moving my arm is the example I use a lot. That would be a behavior. We're not talking about my cells moving around. So for the purposes of our lecture, behavior needs to be observable, it can be repeated, and it needs to be able to be measured. Okay, so if you guys remember back to development, we talked about things being innate. Innate just means that you are born with it. So some skills are innate, meaning you're already born knowing how to do them. Innate behavior is not an example of learning. So if you guys think back to our development chapter where we talked about newborns having different reflexes. So they had that rooting reflex, that sucking reflex, all those different reflexes to help them get nutrition. Those were innate. Nobody had to teach a newborn baby how to do those things. So innate skills are not an example of learning. However, you can have reflexes that are learned. So innate, you're born with it, not learned. Reflexes can sometimes be innate, that can sometimes be learned. So you have your definition here on the screen. Reflexes are a type of stimulus-response relationship So there's some sort of stimulus in the environment, and then you have a response, and it can either be learned or it can be an innate reflex. So when we have an innate reflex, we're born with it. An example would be that rooting reflex that infants have. A learned reflex is something that was not innate but became automatic. So it became a reflex. It was learned over time. So these reflexes, the learned reflexes, become automatic responses. A lot of what we're going to talk about in this learning chapter is conditioning. So you'll hear the terms classical conditioning and operant conditioning a lot. These are the two main types of learning that we're going to talk about. Today is mostly going to be classical conditioning. Operant conditioning will be what we talk about for most of Thursday's class. So classical conditioning is also known as Pavlovian conditioning, and I'll explain that when we get to, I believe, the next slide. And classical conditioning involves associating two events, so a signal and then what's signaled. And that will make sense as we explain more what classical conditioning is. But an example would be if you set different people in your phone contacts to have different ringtones. So an event might be you hear a certain chime going off on your phone, you associate that with maybe your dad calling you. So that is you associating a signal and the thing being signaled. Operant conditioning, on the other hand, also called instrumental conditioning, is how our behavior can be shaped by consequences. So we learn what happens when we do a behavior, when we engage in some behavior, then there are consequences of that behavior, and then the consequences shape future behavior. So we'll talk more about operant conditioning in a lot of detail on Thursday. Today we'll mostly focus on classical conditioning. Before going into that, I want to talk about social learning. So this is another type of learning distinct from those two. And this is just learning from watching others. It could be also called vicarious learning. So an example would be just watching your older sibling do something, and you learn how to do that thing by watching them. So the example I have on this slide is a younger sibling learns to play video games by watching their older sibling. So social learning is exactly what it sounds like. It's just learning by watching other people's behavior. Okay, so most of today is going to be spent on classical conditioning. And like I said, it is also called Pavlovian conditioning. That is because it was discovered by Ivan Pavlov, and he was a Russian scientist, a Russian physiologist, and he was not originally interested in studying conditioning at all. So this is not what he intended to study or discover. He was a physiologist who wanted to study digestion. So he was studying how dogs digest food, including how their saliva works. So you can see in this diagram of this dog set up on this crazy intricate system, he has a tube coming out of the dog's mouth. That's because he was surgically implanting a tube in the dog's mouth to collect saliva as it came out. Saliva just means spit, and he was collecting that saliva to see how much the dog salivated when presented with meat powder. So his original research was completely focused on digestion and physiology. However, he noticed that every time he entered the lab, he was wearing the same lab coat. He would put it on, and the dog would start to salivate before he even presented the meat powder. So every day he would come in the lab, say, "Hey dogs," put on his lab coat, and then the dog would start drooling. He would start responding just to him putting on his lab coat. So Pavlov noticed this interesting reaction, and he said that's strange because lab coats are not very tasty, so why is the dog already salivating? So he noticed this association between him putting on his lab coat and the reaction of the dog salivating. So he decided to shift his research to this exciting new discovery, and he coined what is called classical conditioning now. And so we'll talk more about the stimulus being paired with a response. But he noticed that this unconditioned stimulus, him putting on his lab coat, was being paired with this response of saliva being generated. So eventually, he did more experiments. He started to pair different things with the meat powder. So he paired ringing a bell with presenting meat powder. And then eventually he would just ring the bell and the dogs would start drooling. So he conditioned, that's the term we use, to the dogs to drool just by hearing a bell ringing. Okay. So, as I said, Pavlov discovered classical conditioning. It's also called Pavlovian conditioning after his last name. Classical conditioning is this type of learning in which one seemingly insignificant event signals an important event. So, in his example, the seemingly insignificant event is him putting on his lab coat. That is not something that is naturally paired with you salivating or with a dog salivating. However, the important event is the one where the dog is getting food. So the important event to the dog is, hey, I'm going to get to eat. The seemingly insignificant event is him putting on his lab coat, but that has signaled to the dog that the food is going to come soon. So a conditional stimulus provides information about the presence or absence of an unconditional stimulus. We'll talk more about these terms on the next slide, and I think it's easier to break them down one by one. It can get kind of confusing because the terms are all very similar, so we'll do some examples, and unfortunately you guys aren't physically here, so I'll just go through the examples with you in this video. I'm also going to post these YouTube videos as separate links. I'm not going to make you watch them on my screen, so I think it'll be easier if you're interested in just watching them on your own time on your own computer, and the audio will probably be better that way anyway. Okay, so conditioning terms. A stimulus is anything in the environment that we can detect, we can measure, and it can evoke a response or behavior. So you guys probably already know the word stimulus from our sensation and perception chapter. We talked about things like light being a stimulus. We can detect it, it's measurable, and it can evoke a response or behavior. So stimuli are what tell us about the environment and tell us what to do. If you had a pan of brownies that smell really good, that might be an example of a stimulus that is evoking hunger, or might be making you salivate as a human, or get ready to eat. So that would be a stimulus, and then we have these physiological responses. Okay, so here's where the terms get a little tricky, and there's actually 2 slides of terms, so these 4 terms go together. So I'm going to go through them each one by one for you guys. So we have an unconditional stimulus, and your book abbreviates this as US. And this is a biologically important event that requires no conditioning to affect our behavior. So in the example with Pavlov's dogs, food was the unconditional stimulus. So dogs by nature are going to want food, they need food, it's biological imperative. So the unconditional stimulus was food. It's unconditional, it didn't have to be conditioned. The dogs naturally respond to it. The unconditional response, or UR, is an innate reflex that is a response to that unconditional stimulus. So if the unconditional stimulus is food, the unconditional response that didn't have to be conditioned is the salivation. So unconditional stimulus, the food that the dogs biologically need, they're born to need it. The unconditional response is that innate reflex of salivating. No one taught them to drool when they got meat powder. That's something they did naturally. So with learning, we can produce conditional stimulus and conditional response. So the conditional stimulus, or CS, is something that signals or predicts an unconditional stimulus. So in this example with Pavlov's dogs, the lab coat was the conditional stimulus. So the lab coat is not something that a dog is naturally programmed to respond to. There's nothing in our genetic code that says, ooh, a lab coat, let's start to salivate. So it's conditional. It had to be conditioned. It had to be learned. But it's signaling or predicting to the dog that the unconditional stimulus of food is coming. So if you think back, the unconditional stimulus was food. The conditional stimulus of the lab coat is predicting or signaling that. And then finally, we have conditional responses, or CR, and this is a learned response that occurs to the conditional stimulus in preparation for the unconditional stimulus. So I know that these are all very similar terms. It makes more sense if you think through what each one means, and then you compare it to what that is, and it's, in my opinion, helpful to think of Pavlov's dog's example. So the conditional response is the response that has been conditioned. This is something that's been learned. So in his example, salivating in response to the lab coat was the conditioned response. It had to be learned. And we can tell that learning has occurred when the conditional stimulus causes or forces a conditional response. So when the lab coat causes the salivation, we know that learning has occurred. The dog has paired those two events together. Okay. So reflexes involve unconditional stimuli and responses. So things that are automatic, they have an unconditioned stimulus, so something like food, and then our responses that are automatic. The stimulus forces an involuntary response, like the salivating dogs. So in Pavlov's experiment, food elicited salivation automatically. So that's just something that naturally happened. It was involuntary. Okay. Classical conditioning involves pairing that unconditional stimulus. So remember, an example of that was food with a neutral stimulus, and an example of that was the lab coat. So a neutral stimulus has no meaning, like our lab coat. The stimulus doesn't indicate whether the unconditional stimulus will occur. So the bell or the lab coat, he had several experiments. In Pavlov's example is the neutral stimulus. So it originally, before learning occurred, had no meaning. Originally, the lab coat did not hold any meaning for the dogs, neither did the bell in his later experiments. So dogs don't innately salivate when they hear a bell ring or when you put on a lab coat. It was originally neutral. Well, here is a breakdown of this experiment, and this is basically what we just went through, but I think it's nice to have it laid out in an image. So before the conditioning, before the learning occurs, you have your unconditioned stimulus of food. Sometimes some books abbreviate this UCS. I've used US and UR for most of the, I think for all of my slideshows. So just know that's the same thing. It's just a different abbreviation. So you have your unconditioned stimulus, and it causes this automatic response of salivation, and that's our unconditioned response. You also have a neutral stimulus, and his example, that's the bell or the lab coat, and that does not have a response, so there's no conditioned response yet. During conditioning, we're pairing the neutral stimulus, the bell, with our unconditioned stimulus, the food, and this is leading to our response of salivation, which is still at this point an unconditioned response to the food. After conditioning, so after learning, our conditioned stimulus, the bell, it was previously neutral, now causes the conditioned response or the learned response of salivation. So I think that's a nice little diagram to break it all down for you. Okay, so I have 3 different examples here, and my original plan was to have you guys answer these questions, but since we're doing this as a recording today, I'm just going to go through them with the answers instead of pausing and asking you guys, what do you think the answer is? So I'm going to skip ahead to each answer slide. So in this first example, Calvin was chased and pecked by an aggressive rooster when he was 3 years old. He fled in fear with his heart pounding. As an adult, his heart pounds whenever he sees a rooster. So in this example, the unconditional stimulus is being chased and attacked. So the unconditional stimulus was not conditioned. It's just something that happened. He was chased and attacked. The unconditioned response, it wasn't learned. His heart was automatically pounding. He had that biological fear response. We have the conditional stimulus of seeing a rooster. That was previously a completely neutral experience for him. However, the conditional response after he paired seeing a rooster with being chased and attacked was now that his heart pounds in response just to seeing a rooster. So the conditional stimulus, seeing a rooster, was previously neutral, but now it causes the conditional response of his heart pounding, and he has this fear response to roosters. Okay. So, next example. As a child, you were playing in the yard one day when a neighbor's cat wandered over. As you went to pet the cat, a car backfired loudly. Now you are afraid of cats. So in this example, the unconditional stimulus is that loud, startling noise. Cars backfiring are pretty loud. And the unconditional response is going to be that startle response or that fear response to the loud noise. The conditional stimulus, so remember that's something that was previously neutral, is the presence of a cat. So previously you had no reaction or no negative reaction to cats. However, this neutral stimulus of a cat has been paired with a loud, startling noise. Now it's a conditional stimulus, and it's going to cause this conditional response of fear. Okay. So the last example I have here is a 12-year-old girl gets a kiss from a boy she has a crush on. She tells you that when he kissed her, her heart started racing, and now whenever she sees him, her heart races. So in this example, the unconditional stimulus is the kiss, and it's causing this automatic biological response of heart racing. So in this example, we're assuming that kissing is automatically causing her heart to race. The previously neutral stimulus was seeing the boy. However, this has become a conditional stimulus when it was paired with the unconditional stimulus, and now just seeing him causes the conditional response of this heart racing, this biological response. Okay, so hopefully you guys are noticing the pattern by now, that classical conditioning is pairing that previously neutral stimulus with an already meaningful stimulus. So in the Pavlov's dog's example, the previously neutral stimulus would be putting on the lab coat or ringing a bell, and the already meaningful stimulus is food being presented. So we know this neutral stimulus, so lab coat or bell, has become a conditional stimulus when it elicits a conditional response before the unconditional stimulus is even presented. So we know that the neutral stimulus of the lab coat, for example, being put on has become a conditional stimulus when the dog is salivating before they're even presented with the unconditional stimulus of food. So the conditional response, the CR, is a measure of learning occurring. Conditional and unconditional responses often look the same. So in both cases, in Pavlov's dog's example, they're both salivating, but the conditional response occurs in preparation for and prior to the unconditional stimulus. So the conditional response of salivating in response to the lab coat occurs in preparation for seeing the food. It happens before the food is presented. Okay, and I just in here in red put what each of these would be for the Pavlov's dog's example. So Pavlov paired the bell, which was neutral, with food, meaningful. The bell became a conditional stimulus when the dog started salivating before even seeing the food. Both the unconditional response and conditional response are salivating, so they look the same. But like we said, the CR is salivating in preparation for the food. Okay. So what I was going to have you do is a little activity thinking about how you can use classical conditioning in your own life. So how does classical conditioning relate to sleep? So what does your bed prepare your body for? And what is your conditioned response to being in your bed at home? So you guys can just think about that a little bit on your own. What you do in your bed, what kinds of things, when you get in your bed, what is your body getting ready to do? So I'm giving you a chance to think about it, but I'm also trying to fix my slide here. Okay. So if you think about it, the different activities that you do in your own bed are starting to condition you to prepare for those activities. So for example, if you always go on your phone when you're lying in bed at night, then the act of just getting in bed in your mind is starting to be paired with, it's time to be on my phone, it's time to be awake, it's time to go on social media, etc., whatever you do on your phone. So in this example, the act of getting in bed is going to prepare your body to be awake and stimulated and ready to interact online. So one tip you can use to make your bed a more sacred space, as they call it, is to only use your bed for things like sex and sleep. And this will basically condition your body to get tired when you get in bed, instead of being awake and lying in bed for hours trying to fall asleep. So one nice way you can use this classical conditioning for your own benefit would be to do those other activities in a different spot so that you are not pairing those stimuli with other activities. Okay. Make your bed a conditioned stimulus for sleep. All right. So we're going to briefly talk about taste aversion. And so this is an example of pairing the taste of a food with a unfortunate biological response. So some of you guys might have really strong taste aversions to something where you ate that food and then you threw up, or you were sick when you ate it and now you don't like it anymore. Taste aversion is so strong that it can happen after only one pairing. So I know I personally can recall a time when I was sick and I drank some sort of pina colada flavored smoothie, and now I cannot stand that flavor. And that is incredibly common because taste aversion can happen so immediately after only one pairing. So maybe after only one time of being sick. So an example would be bacteria existing in undercooked food. So maybe you eat something that was undercooked. The unconditional response is getting sick because you ate those bacteria, or you have nausea, or you threw up. The conditional stimulus is going to be the taste and flavor of that specific food. So that's something that was previously neutral. Maybe you even liked that food. However, the conditional response is now going to be experiencing that nausea or experiencing that sickness whenever you taste that specific flavor. So taste aversion is a nice example of classical conditioning, but it's very strong and it can happen after only one pairing. So usually in the Pavlov dogs example, he had to do that experiment over and over again for the dogs to learn to associate the bell ringing with getting food. In this example of eating bad food, that only had to happen one time. And I think for a lot of you guys, you might have experienced something like you got sick after eating something only one time, or not that any of you guys drink, but maybe if you did, you threw up one time and now you can't stand a specific flavor. So taste aversion is an example of classical conditioning that happens immediately. Okay. So we're going to skip over this activity, but you can think of examples of classical conditioning in your own life. Obviously, I'm not going to have you guys do this and turn it in, but you can just think about it on your own. Okay. Oops, there we go. Okay. So when we talk about classical conditioning, we also have extinction of that pairing and spontaneous recovery of the pairing. One of the videos that I was going to show you all explains this very, very well. So I'd recommend watching that video to get a better idea of extinction and spontaneous recovery. But extinction is when you start to present that conditional stimulus without the unconditional stimulus. So for example, if I started presenting those dogs with only the bell, but then I wasn't giving them food anymore, and I kept ringing the bell without giving them food, eventually they're going to learn that it's no longer predicting that unconditional stimulus. It's no longer predicting getting food. So extinction occurs when they're no longer having that conditioned response because they realize that connection is no longer there. Spontaneous recovery happens when suddenly there's a break in presenting that conditional stimulus, and then we have a recovery in that learned behavior. So I ring the bell, I don't give them food. The dogs are like, whatever, ringing the bell is actually not important. We're not going to salivate anymore. I take a break, and then I ring the bell again after a period of time. There's a spontaneous recovery of that conditioned response. So all of a sudden they're going to go back to that previously learned behavior of salivating in response to the bell. However, it's not going to be as powerful of a response as it was when it was originally learned. So you can see that in this graph. The strength of the conditional response is our y-axis, and we have spontaneous recovery happening here after a pause in time, but it's not going to be as strong of a conditional response. So they might not salivate as much, or maybe not, they might not be as likely to do it. And then extinction is eventually going to happen again when I stop pairing the bell with the food. Okay. Generalization is also covered in that video that I'm posting for you guys, so I recommend to watch that because I just really like the way that they lay all of these out, and they have a good example. Stimulus generalization is when similar stimuli elicit the same conditional response. So imagine you're bitten by a brown recluse spider. You might develop a fear of brown recluse spiders, but you might experience stimulus generalization where you just become afraid of all spiders. So you're generalizing the stimulus. We also have conditional generalization where situations or locations where something happened become conditioned stimuli. So in our spider example, we might fear objects or locations where spiders even live or where we saw that spider. Okay. We also have what's called stimulus discrimination. This is where similar stimuli do not elicit a conditioned response. So you are discriminating between the specific stimuli. So you're bitten by a brown recluse spider, you develop a specific fear of the brown recluse spider, but not a tarantula or not a wolf spider or not any other kind of spider. So stimulus discrimination, you're discriminating between those specific different types of stimuli instead of generalizing. Okay. This is an example experiment that I'll post the link to, and you guys can watch that on your own time. We might have actually watched the Little Albert experiment in one of the past chapters. If so, you can watch it again or not. I think we might have watched it in class, but that has an example of some of these things, and then here's the other video I'll post with extinction, spontaneous recovery, generalization, and discrimination. Okay. So when we do therapy for things like phobias and fears, one technique that's useful is called systematic desensitization. Phobias can be learned through having a really traumatic experience, and you're starting to pair that experience and things around that experience with your fear. So once you become afraid of that thing, you're likely going to avoid it and avoid situations where you might run into it again. This actually maintains the phobia. So phobias are maintained through avoidance. If you get bitten by a spider, you become very afraid of spiders. You are probably going to avoid spiders, and that's actually maintaining the fear. So the more you avoid them, the more that's maintaining that fear or that phobia. Systematic desensitization is gradually exposing you to the thing you're afraid of, so the phobic object. But the important piece of this is without negative consequences. So if I gradually expose you to spiders, but you're getting bitten every time, that's not going to break the fear. However, gradually exposing you to spiders, but there's never any bad consequences, it's in a safe space, nothing bad happens, that is going to slowly help you desensitize to that stimulus. And so we'll go through on the next slide what's called a fear hierarchy, but it's basically introducing that phobic object, the thing you're afraid of, in different stages, in gradual stages. Oh, I think it's a couple slides after. So an example would be if you have a fear of dogs, we would slowly and gradually expose you to dogs. So different levels of exposure are going to look very different. The first level might just be saying the word dog, then maybe looking at pictures of dogs, watching videos of dogs. Level 5 might be looking at a dog that's securely behind a fence that can't be near you. Level 8 might be actually petting a dog, maybe on a leash. And then level 9 might be something like you are taking a dog on a walk. So this is an example of systematic desensitization. It's gradual exposure. And this is the fear hierarchy. This is an example I used of if your fear is giving oral presentation. So this is a fear hierarchy for fear of public speaking. So you can see at the bottom, the easiest step is just identifying the topic for your presentation. So not a fun step, but you're just kind of dipping your toe in the water. Then you might observe other people's presentations, practice your presentation alone, then video record your presentation and observe it. So you're starting to get more into exposing the fear, then practicing in front of your family, towards the top, practicing in front of your friends, and then the final level of the fear hierarchy would be giving your final presentation in class. So this is the same example of gradually exposing the person to the fear. Okay, so that's the end of the classical conditioning lecture. Chapter 7 reading is going to be due Tuesday before class. So even if you're not attending the Zoom lecture, it's going to be due at 11. Just like before, all the homeworks will be due at that time before class. And then I just wanted to remind you guys about the research requirement that's ongoing. So if that's something you haven't started yet, I would recommend doing some online surveys, especially because I don't know what the semester is going to hold. So if I were you, I would try to get them out of the way now while everyone's still kind of trying to do their work. They're probably doing their online research still. If there is a significant problem towards the ends of the semester, I will definitely keep that in mind, but I don't think you guys should have a problem just doing the online surveys. I think those should all stay up, and I don't think those will change. So I don't anticipate it being a problem, but if it were a problem, then just like attendance, I will definitely keep that in mind.